Welcome to Wait, What Do You Do Again? I'm your host, Megan DeFord, and today we're joined by Dr. Cailin Murray in Stepping in Between Spaces, In Between Worlds, where ghosts, monsters, and haunted histories tell us more about the living than the dead. Dr. Murray is an anthropologist whose research explores Native American ghost stories, Sasquatch sightings, and what our fascination with the supernatural reveals about memory, place, and belief. She is so cool. You're going to love this conversation. It's part ghost story yap session, part cultural deep dive, and one of those conversations that might just linger after you turn off the lights. Hey, do something that's not scary, and if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe, leave a review, share it with a friend. It really does make a big difference, and I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, let's go talk to Dr. Murray. Cailin, thank you so much for being here today.
For having me.
Yeah, Dr. Murray is an associate professor of anthropology, and I have to read from your bio online. Your research areas include two overlapping streams: the environmental ethnohistory of settler colonialism in North America and the anthropology of the supernatural. Dr. Murray teaches ethnohistorical methods, the anthropology of folklore and folk life, magic, witchcraft, and religion, Native Americans of the Eastern Woodlands, Introduction to Native American Studies, and the anthropology of everyday life, monsters in our midst. How cool are you?
As you read it, I think I sound a little more like schizoid. It seems like a lot of things, but but actually all those streams do intersect in my own brain.
Yes.
Sort of.
Yeah. It's very cool. And you have said, we are in spooky season. We're in October, and you have said that Halloween is the best holiday. What is it about this season that speaks to you both as a storyteller and a scholar?
I think it's from the time I was a young child, I was always the kid who wanted to watch the scary movies, and I watched them all that I could possibly watch. And I think that Halloween to me speaks to so many different things. I think you can't have light without darkness. And so that sort of embracing the darkness of this time of year to me is especially engaging and interesting to do. And I actually spend a lot of time in my research talking about dark things, things that are scary, things that are spooky. So Halloween is my way of sort of framing all of that, but it's actually also fun. So it also gives me a break from all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you like being scared? Like, are you more on the Charlie Brown side of Halloween or more on the Mike Myers side of Halloween?
100% Mike Myers side of Halloween.
Okay.
I love to be scared. And I've actually, this is going to sound crazy. I actually started sort of thinking about ghosts for a couple of different reasons. And one of them is when I was, and this is something I'm going to talk about later when you ask me about things I would talk to with my younger self.
Yeah.
When I was a college student, I was also a single mom of a 2-year-old, and so I started college and he was 2. And then in year 3, I got cancer and I almost died. And so I think that the ghost thing sort of emerged then. I just didn't fully embrace it. I didn't quite know that it was, I was spending so much time maybe in my subconscious self, thinking more and more about what the other side might be. And then when I hit graduate school, I started getting more, sort of theoretical ideas about, human experiences and humans' experiences with beliefs and religion and those kinds of things. That was all really interesting to me as well. And so it kind of boiled down to finding out, or sort of, finding out through sort of maybe self-exploration, but also through academic exploration, that there was a lot to say about how we embrace things that are liminal, things that we don't fully understand. You can be alive, but feel like maybe you're not completely alive. There are people who are on life support, who are technically alive, but not fully, right? So there's all kinds of sort of these in-between states that we can experience where we're given, or we give other people the opportunity to imagine the other, what happens after you die.
Yeah.
And so that was really interesting to me. And then I've actually had some haunting experiences. So when that happened, when those things happen, what I always tell my students is, sure, it's really easy to dismiss the whole thing about ghosts until you see one.
Yeah.
And then it becomes really, really difficult to dismiss it.
Yeah.
And what I found is because I was working in populations of people for whom these are not unusual events. These are things that happen to people all the time. They see spirits, they see ghosts, they see all kinds of things. And so it's never really a question, is it real or is it not real? It's not really understood metaphorically, it's understood as part of the natural world. So we have this concept in English of supernatural. And it works really well for Western culture because we do make those divides between things that are both natural and not natural. But in other cultures, particularly in like the native cultures that I've worked in, that's not such a hard and fast rule. It's more like, well, no, spirits are they're out there, they're part of the environment, like we're part of the environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted, it was kind of good that I had those experiences because it made me very open and empathetic to the stories people were telling me. And it wasn't my first impulse to dismiss them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
And
those two things, yeah.
yeah, and I'm so glad that you're still here with us. I can certainly understand why going through cancer you would have these experiences and maybe feel closer to that understanding and thinking about it. But you've also talked about Karl Marx as
I know, it's
influencing.
crazy.
Can you talk about that connection a little bit?
I can. When I was a first year graduate student at the University of Washington, um, and how it's set up is that we were all cultural anthropology graduate students. And so there were 18 of us in this core course. So for the first year, you sit around a table and you're assigned a lot of things to read, giant stacks of books, and you debate the ideas within them. And at first you start out, everybody's all shiny and excited. By the end, their people have clustered into their ideological groups and we're
Yeah.
all pretty sick of each other. But about midstream, we were reading Karl Marx. And there was a lot to say about Karl Marx. He's an interesting and engaging writer, and he has lots of ideas. But what I couldn't get past was how often he talked about vampires and ghosts. Um, and nobody else at the table, and this was like in the early 90s, nobody else at the table was particularly interested in that. And so you kind of quickly learn, where the energy of the room is going. And so you just sort of let it go there. But in my mind, I told myself someday it's not going to be like this. Someday I'm going to have an opportunity to fully explore these ideas, and I'm going to. And I did,
Yeah.
but it took getting tenure and, some other things.
Yeah.
It was actually my pre-tenure edited volume with a friend of mine in Vancouver, that was sort of one of the big things for me getting tenure. And that was a whole book about Native peoples and ghost stories, and not just like the stories that Native people tell about ghosts, or that was part of it, but also the ways that Indian ghosts frame non-Native people's understanding of their own history. It's like we have these two streams of things that I call the two original sins of America. And one is slavery and one is colonialism. You have these stories of haunted Indian burial grounds. It's a trope that appears all over the United States. And a similar trope is the haunted slave quarters.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that that is how people sort of understand and want to frame things is it's a history that just literally will not die. It comes back in the form of these stories. And so even if people want to sort of deny the reality of that, the stories are there to remind people that in fact, we haven't begun to resolve these issues as a nation.
Yeah.
And so we talk about that as well, and so those are kind of the two things. In the piece I wrote for that particular volume, I was really interested in a burial ground in Port Angeles, Washington. And it was part of the tribe that I was working with at the time where I was doing field work. It was one of their ancient communities, and it was very, very old. The city of Port Angeles wanted to do economic development because it was right on the waterfront. And because of, various state laws and federal laws, they had to bring in somebody like archaeologists in to make sure that there was nothing there, that they would not be disturbing cultural kinds of sites. And so the very first day they start working on the project, they dug into a burial. And so then they bring the archaeologists in, right? And so by the time they were done, it went on for several months. The tribal members were actually working on the site as like archaeological technicians and helping, which was good. And I mean, it was a good collaborative project in that regard. But what was happening is that many of the people who were working on the site were bringing ghosts home with them. And so they were having very strange haunting experiences that the Native people were. So it ended up being very disturbing for them. And because they were digging into ancestral burials, it was like digging up your own grandma.
Yeah.
It was a very traumatic and difficult thing, and people, it was just very upsetting. Eventually, what happened is the burials were reemplaced. Some of the artifacts were kept by the tribe, who then opened up a museum. So they have a way to interpret those things for tourists, which is good economic development for the area. But they never developed the site. It remains what it is. It's a beach site, and it will never be developed.
Good.
That was sort of the agreement that was made. And so my piece was really interested not just in sort of the stories that non-native people tell about haunted burial places, but the fact here was an actual native burial ground, and it was haunting tribal people too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
What what is going on with those stories that we've told about haunted burial grounds and, haunted enslaved quarters or, I think I realized it, but didn't actually think about it until you said it. Like that is a trope that's happening, if that's the right word for it. But what is going on with that? Why are we telling that story and those stories?
I think, I sort of look at this in different ways, but I would agree with my colleague Carl Thrush, who I wrote with, that it is kind of and other scholars have said much the same thing, is that it signals something that we both are sad about. Oh, people were enslaved. Oh, people lost their land. People were killed. They were removed. Here in the Eastern Woodlands, people were removed to Oklahoma. So thousands of people, and they died. It was, it's a tragic thing for the tribes from the Eastern Woodlands. And we could be sad about that, but on the other hand, we're kind of happy about it too, because we couldn't have America without those events happening. So there is this conflation of opposites. You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying?
Yeah.
And by telling those stories, it's a way of sort of saying, I acknowledge that what happened maybe was bad, but I'm not going to let it bother me enough, because it's just a ghost story.
Right, right. That's
Mhm.
interesting. It's also interesting to think about it's never like benevolent ghosts, right? Like it's never it's never like, oh, these are
Sometimes it is.
it is. Oh,
There
okay.
are a lot
Interesting.
of like settler colonial stories of, oh, this native ghost came to me and told me it was so great that I lived on their land, and they gave me their blessing. And yeah, it can be very self-serving too.
Yeah, that's a very self-serving ghost story.
But it
But
could
I
be
guess
but it could be scary, sort of, oh no, kind
right.
of,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, even I guess if it's benevolent or malevolent, like it's serving a story that we want to tell, right? And
Yes, that's a good way to put it. It is
yeah.
serving a story we want to tell.
That's really fascinating. And so, as you've studied, and if I'm saying anything incorrectly, please correct me, but you study Native American ghost stories and folklore. And what are some of the recurring themes or figures that emerge and in these traditions? And you studied Native American tribes across the country, or is it a specific region that you've studied?
I have mostly I have studied in the Pacific Northwest,
Okay.
those
Yeah.
those topics, but I did do a piece on native ghosts haunting um, people around the issue of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, NAGPRA. And that was work that I did here in Indiana, in the Midwest. Um, it was interesting to me because there's always this, that there are, and this may be common knowledge or not, I'm not sure, but I'll just explain NAGPRA quickly to you so
Yeah.
your listeners know. This law was passed in 1990. It was actually passed by the first Bush administration. It's a good law.
Yeah.
Um, what it enabled was for tribes, federally recognized tribes, the ones that have legal treaties with the United States government, to repatriate human remains and funerary objects. And now it's been expanded to other kinds of objects as well, from museums that took them maybe under nefarious circumstances,
Hmm.
often under nefarious circumstances, and held them. And so a place like the Smithsonian or the Natural History Museum in New York City would have, thousands of human remains,
Yeah.
and they weren't really doing much with them. They just had them there, right? And so the tribe's response was, well, it's been a long time. Can we have those back, for the ones
Yeah.
that wanted to repatriate, so we can bury them with dignity, and so we can put them back where they originated, and put the grave objects that were found with them back with them, that sort of thing. And so NAGPRA was passed to facilitate that. And it's been around now since 1990, and the law has, it's changed over the years. A university started out feeling, they're one of the facilities that holds human remains, feeling threatened by this, threatened by the fact that their collections, that they gathered, the archaeologists gathered, whatever, or could be taken back. But I think that has changed a lot in this time span. And that nowadays, most people working in universities, who have anything to do with those kinds of collections are more than happy to accommodate tribes and do the best they can. Not always, but I would say often. And it's federal law, so they really actually don't have a choice in it. It's just,
Yeah.
How fast they're going to, do it or not do it.
Yeah.
And so what has come out of that was like we had somebody who contributed a chapter to the book I did with Carl Thrush, who worked in a museum that was haunted by spirits, and that saw that as being sort of directly related to the human remains that were being held in that museum. And so that was interesting to me. And we've had, like, here at my university, we were the first university in the state of Indiana to have what are called, they are grants where the tribes can come in and work with the university on figuring out how they're going to facilitate, who has claims to the various things that are in your collections and how we would facilitate their return. And it's a long, drawn out process. So it requires a lot of meetings. It requires a lot of just working together and building trust in those relationships. And so we were the first to have those kinds of grants here in the state of Indiana. And one of the things that sort of happened over time is that the members of various tribes that had connections to the collections that we held would come in and do spiritual ceremonies. Maybe they would, burn sage, or they would do something, right, in the facility where the actual remains are. They would want to, go in and they would interact. We would not be present with them when they were interacting with those remains. That was their time to do that and to do what they needed to do, whatever that was. And that was really interesting to me, sort of this interface between spirit and belief and religion and science. And so I have written about that in the context of our collections.
That's really, there's so much there to unpack. And I'm sort of embarrassed to say that as you're talking and you're using the word collections, it's something that we take for granted, this word collections, and these are human remains, and these are remains of individuals' lives.
Right.
It could be shoes, it could be, whatever. And it's interesting how what we take for granted, let's put it that way,
Very.
and that's really incredible that not only does that law exist, but that Indiana was the first to have those grants to help facilitate that.
Actually, it was our university was the first in the state of Indiana.
Oh, okay.
Other universities have had them too.
Got it.
It took longer east of the Mississippi River because so many of the tribes here were removal tribes. And so it just added a layer of, I would say, complication.
Yeah.
That is not so obvious when you go west of the Mississippi, where most Native peoples live, and where the tribes are sort of readily right there. So in Washington State, where I'm from, the tribes are all around, the entire state, and so you have tribal leaders who, have no problem picking up the phone and calling somebody and saying, we need to talk about this, right?
Sure.
But here it was a little bit different.
Yeah. And it's interesting on the East Coast, where I've lived my entire life. It's in the names of our cities and streets, and it wasn't until I moved to Florida with the Seminoles, which is a conglomeration of multiple tribes, which I learned when I moved here. I was like, wow, we learned about the Algonquin, we learned about the Iroquois, but like there was no real representation, at least when I was growing up, of the way that it is here in Florida. And then when I went out west,
really
to your point, it was like, whoa, this is very different than what I've experienced and what I'm used to. Do you see in the Pacific Northwest and the tribes that you've worked with, do you see any sort of recurring themes in folklore or in ghost stories? And maybe taking a step back, is that concept of a ghost similar to, like Charles Dickens' Ebenezer Scrooge ghost and what we think about ghosts sort of in Western culture.
I think so because people, I mean, oftentimes like the ghosts that I feel like the hauntings that people on the reservation where I worked talked about were very personal. I mean, they really viewed them as, well, these are our ghosts. They may be ghosts. They I think most people would not consider it necessarily a positive thing, to see a ghost. That it means something. It has religious and spiritual significance,
Yeah.
if those kinds of things are coming around you. And it's something that people generally will find some way to deal with, some sort of spiritual or religious sort of solution to that, right?
Yeah.
But it's also extremely personal because you would see yourself being haunted by the ancestors of your people. Whereas, the ghost I saw in Seattle was this is so crazy, was a cyclist of all things.
That tracks.
I mean, what we had in common is that I was cycling too.
And then you were competing. No,
No, I'm sure he would have won.
That's funny.
So
That's funny.
it's, I certainly didn't view him as like, oh, there's my ancestor, right?
Right.
It's a different sort of thing. I mean, I guess it could be like Scrooge in the sense that Scrooge is haunted by somebody he knows.
That's true. Yeah.
Who is there to give him a shakeup.
Right.
Whereas again, I didn't feel like I was being shook up. I just feel like I just happened to experience something that was very odd and that I couldn't explain, and that happened directly in front of my eyes at 10 o'clock in the morning on the Burke-Gilman Trail in Seattle, Washington.
Yeah, that is really odd. Honestly, though, if you're going to be caught in the after, I don't even know the right words for it, but cycling seems pretty great. I mean,
Well, and I actually think, do you want to hear the story?
I do, of course.
So in 2015, I was back in Seattle and I lived there for a year. I was teaching all my classes remotely and doing research in Seattle. And I was staying with my cousin. She had a guest house. So I was staying there, and it was like, it was a few miles from the University of Washington where I was doing the bulk of that. So I would get on my bike and ride there. It was just quicker than Seattle traffic.
Sure.
So one day I was riding my bike and I went by what's called a ghost bike. I don't know if you know what this is, but if a cyclist dies in an area,
yeah,
people will take their bike and spray paint it white and put it up as a memorial. And so this man had died like right near where I was living. He'd been hit by a truck that came down when he was on the Burke-Gilman Trail. So it's always a sad thing, in such a situation like that, especially when you cycle. It's always kind of dangerous in cities, and it's a good reminder of life's tenuous hold.
Yeah.
Right. And so I stopped for a minute and I just sort of, respectfully paid my respects to the ghost bike. And then I moved on. And then a few days later, I was back on the Burke-Gilman Trail in a different location. And I had come up to a street, it was a road, and I actually had to stop because you had to check for cross traffic. And I stopped my bike and I look across and I'm not really thinking about it. I'm just, riding.
Sure.
And there was two ladies walking with, they sort of stood out because it was a sunny, hot day in Seattle, and they had an umbrella to keep the sun off their faces. It was kind of a charming little scene, these two older ladies, arm in arm with their little umbrella. And I thought, oh, that's sweet, And then behind them, I see a man standing there, an older man, and he's wearing bike clothes, the jersey, all that, and a helmet. He's got a beard, he's definitely older than I was, definitely, maybe more in his upper 60s or something like that, right? And again, I didn't think anything about it. It's not strange. He was just staring right at what is a particularly nice view of Lake Washington. It's right there. And so I had stopped my bike and I did this, turned my head, turned back up. That's exactly how much time it took. The ladies were still there and he had completely disappeared. And there was nowhere for him to go that I wouldn't have seen him.
Yeah.
There was just, it was impossible. I can't literally explain that. And I believe, the sort of the woo-woo part of me believes it was that man.
Yeah.
The man who died. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. And
It's strange.
yeah, but so you've also lived in a haunted house? Is that correct?
I did. I've lived in two haunted houses.
Oh, okay.
100% honest. I don't know what to like because it sounds so crazy, but I did. And this one is actually a even better story because at the time it was actually my ex-husband, my son, and I all lived in this house. My son was a student here at Ball State.
Okay.
And my ex-husband was upstairs in our home office doing something. I was down in the living room reading, and my son was taking a shower. He had his own room in an ensuite,
Oh,
so
nice.
he was in there, taking a shower. And I'm just sitting there. It was like a Sunday afternoon. It was nothing special.
Sure.
And all of a sudden I hear it was an old house. So there were these wooden stairs going upstairs, and I heard these footsteps that like little kid running, that's a very distinctive sound, right?
Sure.
And I heard that and I was like, oh, that's weird. We didn't have, a dog or anything like that. We didn't have anything that could be making that noise. And I'm a mom, so I know what it sounds like when children go up and down stairs. And then so we heard the little footsteps, and then it kind of took a pause, took a beat. And then on my son's bathroom door, there was just like that. And I'm sitting there going, oh, and I can hear my son going, what? Because he thought it was me, being an annoying mom,
Yeah.
And I'm still sitting on the couch, taking it all in. And then my ex-husband comes to the top of the stairs. He goes, did you just hear that? And I said, yeah, I did just hear that. So all three of us had, pretty much the same experience, only my son didn't hear the footsteps, but he did definitely heard the knocking. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then later, much later, in that same house, we were bringing groceries in through the back door one day, and my ex-husband he kept moving through to the living room, and I was kind of behind him. And so I'm walking along, and all of a sudden he had done an about face, and he was like right there. And he literally, if you talk about somebody like the color drains from their face, this is exactly what I saw. And he was like this. He goes, there's a little girl in our living room.
Oh my God.
I never saw her. I will say, never saw her. But I believed him. My husband was a member of the tribe that I was married into. And so these are not unusual things, but it was definitely not something he wanted to see in the living room.
Yeah.
So I went out and bought, she was like a little old-fashioned girl, like maybe from another century.
Yeah.
But he described. So I went out and bought a little old-fashioned doll and put it up in the attic.
Yeah.
We never heard from her again.
Interesting.
That was the end of that. But yeah, so strange things, but
yeah,
it also makes me empathetic. When people tell me those stories, I'm the first to say, yeah, I get it.
Oh yeah. And most people have had some sort of experience, right? Like the one that I have never figured out 100% was with my ex, and we were asleep, and we both were awoken at the same time, and we heard this shh, like in our ears, like it was like someone was standing right next to me. He had the same
That kind of gave me shivers.
And we both like jerked up in bed, and outside the window was a raven or a crow, like this big black bird just staring at us, and we were like, what?
Life just took an Edgar Allan Poe turn.
Yes, very, very much so. And I did say something like to the room. I was like, hey, if you're here, like you can stay here. I'm sorry if you feel threatened, whatever. Like, and you do feel a little kooky dukes doing that. But I was like, there was someone in that room with us, and someone was trying to send us a message, and like our lease is up in a year, so just if we can live together, that'd be great. But
I think that's really pragmatic, and that's exactly what I would recommend people do. Is to just say, you know what, don't scare me because it upsets me.
Yeah, and I had a friend who in Richmond bought a historic home. He was an architect, is an architect, and was having issues with a child ghost. And he did find out there were pretty good records and some things had happened in that house. Yeah. And he did what you did. And up in the attic, he left a basketball. He left like just some toys. Never had an issue with the kid again. He would hear, and I heard it, like the basketball going. And it's like, oh my God. But he was like...
The doll never like did baby crying or anything.
Yeah, no. But it was interesting. He was like, it never happens at night, like very respectful. And I was just like, oh my gosh. But it does make you feel a little kooky. But when you live with it, I don't know, it becomes very real.
I think that, it's like one of the other big experiences I had, which was not really my experience. It was my son's, and he was 3 at the time. And this is the time when I was sick, and I used to read stories to him at night, when he'd go to sleep. So I'd lay in bed with him, we'd read stories. And oftentimes I would fall asleep too, because sick,
Yeah.
I was just tired. And so we were laying there, and just sort of, talking and reading stories. And all of a sudden, and my son, he didn't have strong speech at that age.
Hmm.
So he did a lot of, gesturing and a lot of, little words and things like that. But
Yeah.
he looked over, he wasn't listening to the story anymore. He was looking at the doorway of his room, and he was smiling and laughing like something was there, like he was interacting with something.
Yeah.
And I finally said, what are you doing?
Yeah.
What's going on there, Alaric? And he said, Grandpa Chuck, which was my dad, who he never met, who died
Whoa.
long before he was born,
Yeah.
and Grandma Mooney, who died when he was little, but he was so little that he would have no memory of her,
Sure.
right? He said, Grandpa Chuck and Grandma Mooney. And I'm like, I'm really sick. And I'm thinking, I don't know if I want my dead relatives to be, gathering in the doorway of my son's room while I'm, trying to battle cancer. But if you're here for a good reason, thanks.
And you're like, now's not the time. It's
That's
just
not the
not
time to
it.
be thinking about that.
Yeah.
It's like the people who have like stories of their kids who are just, remembering past lives. And it's like,
Yes.
some of them are startling because I do listen to a lot of podcasts where people share narratives of that nature because
Hmm.
that stuff is just will never stop being interesting to me. And I do have a whole one I've listened to just on reincarnation because it's
Yeah.
such a strong belief among
Yes.
so many cultures. And it's so the idea of a recycled soul just seems so intriguing to me.
It's so intriguing. And I had a guest one, Dr. Not Dr. Father Nathan Castle a few months ago, and he's a Dominican priest who helps souls who are stuck. Like if they died traumatically and can't get out of the trauma, like they're kind of stuck there. And I was
That's so
like,
cool.
yeah, it was a great conversation. It sort of broke my brain a few times with what he was talking about. Um, but it does seem like there's different, he described it as like a radio dial. Like there's different radio waves in the spiritual world. And I was like, wow, this is wild. So we've certainly veered off into interesting conversation. This is your whole life. Um, but you've also researched Sasquatch. And like,
Yes.
what have you, and especially with the Pacific Northwest, like, what have you learned about the cultural or symbolic significance of this figure, if any, in Indigenous communities?
So much. I would say that mostly the way he's always been explained to me in that context is that he's a particularly powerful spirit power.
Mm,
But people see him all the time. That's not an uncommon thing. And I've collected many stories, from Native peoples about those kinds of sightings.
yeah,
And what I always say to my students is, and this kind of goes towards how to frame other people's experiences, however, they may seem odd to us or to me, but they're framing it as something that's truly happened to them, right? They're not just speaking in metaphor. And what I say to my students is that, well, these are folks that I know really well. These are folks who I literally trusted with the life of my child,
right.
who, my son came with me when I married the person I married, who's a member of that tribe,
Yeah,
and they have always been nothing but incredibly gracious and loving towards him and towards me as well, so very grateful for that. So there's that. Said there are people that I would hand my wallet to if it was stuffed with $100 bills and I would
sure.
know that it would come back with all the money in it.
Yeah,
That's trust, right? And then they tell me these things happen. Why would I not believe them? Because
of
they've never
course.
given me a reason not to believe them.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what's going on with Sasquatch, I don't begin to know. I mean, that's where I've written quite a lot about Sasquatch,
Hmm.
and I never come to any big conclusion. And really, actually, it was another Native scholar, a guy named John Lowe, who is from the Pokagon Potawatomi tribe in Michigan. And John Lowe wrote a really great book about Potawatomi history in the city of Chicago.
Hmm.
And came down, we brought him to Ball State to speak to students, and it was great to have him. And one of the things he talks about in his book, and that he and I talked about, was he just feels no need to explain those disconnects.
Mm,
That there's things he learned growing up in a Native household with Native grandparents and parents and aunties and uncles and all that, that he values, that as much or more even, than
Hmm.
anything he ever learned in school.
Yeah.
And so he gave me a framework for how to explain that to people. And so what I always say is it's not really my job to prove or disprove the existence of Sasquatch. I have no need to do that,
Yeah.
because as far as I'm concerned, if I could see a cyclist disappear on the Burt Gilman Trail in
Sure.
Seattle, why
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
Sasquatch? What matters more is that I understand why people say he shows up. For one thing, it's that this is where all my work comes together. It all intersects, because what I'm really interested in is belief about the environment.
Hmm.
Where do people get the ideas they have that connect them to places? How do places become alive for them?
Yeah.
And those kinds of stories, whether it's ghosts haunting Indian burial grounds or Native peoples talking about Sasquatch sightings, those stories very much connect people to place one way or the other. And so that's what I'm interested in, is what counts as proof for them. How do they know that what they had was an authentic experience?
Yeah.
That's what I try to understand.
Yeah. And for when you're talking about place, in a very literal sense, how does the environment tend to influence these stories or these entities that show up in different communities? Whether it's lakes or mountains or abandoned homes or spaces, like, does that influence?
Well, his dad was Irish and his mom came from a Romana Chal family. They, gypsy, for lack of a
Yeah.
better word.
Hmm.
But he grew up very much in an Irish community in Butte, Montana. And when I was growing up, he would tell me stories about how, like, his family were all copper miners. That's what you do in Butte, Montana,
Yeah.
or what you did,
Yeah.
But they all, all the people, like his dad's family, were all from Ireland, and they had these stories. They already had kind of a rich history of doing mining in Ireland, and they have these stories about these, little people that live in the mines, and they basically brought the little people with them. Is
Hmm.
is how I understood it when he, maybe not when he was telling me those stories as a kid, but later as an anthropologist, I reconsidered them.
Yeah.
Right. And he said, they would do things like they would bring their lunch, and then they would leave food in the mine
Hmm.
because they didn't want to get into trouble with the little people.
Yeah.
And so that was making that place an Irish place in a very specific sort of
Interesting.
way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That was making that place feel comfortable for Irish people who
Right.
mostly in Butte, when he was growing up, were still many, many immigrants or children of immigrants.
Sure.
So those ideas, they burn brightly and they burn for a long time,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
And with Sasquatch, one of the reasons I got interested in doing stories on Sasquatch is I was back in the community, like in 2005. We'd gone back for the summer, for part of the summer. And all the little kids were seeing Sasquatch. It was like a thing. It was like this, it was just happening all over the res. And I was like, what is going on? And the community dealt with it in such an interesting way. It was probably one of the most beautiful things I ever got to witness, and it was, people in the community are different religions. There are people who are evangelical Christians. There are people who are more they call it the smokehouse religion. It's their more traditional views. And then there's this group that sort of sits between them. They're members of what's called the Indian Shaker Church, which
Mm.
is a religion that combines both aspects of Christianity and aspects of the traditional religion. Started in the late 19th century. It was kind of in response to a bigger influx of settlers coming in and changing things and missionaries coming in. And it was a way to hold on to things that felt authentically Clallam, that's for this tribe, but also engage some new ideas of
Mhm.
things. And so it's basically those are the three big faiths in the community. And so what the community didn't want to do, the kids were scared. They were seeing Sasquatch, and there's a lot of, little kids, they were just kind of all freaking out a little bit. They didn't want to pick one of those traditions. They wanted to make sure everybody was covered. So they brought in three elders, and they brought in someone who represented the Christians, somebody who represented the Shaker Church, and somebody who was more traditional, old school. And had them all there in this room, and then they brought all the families in, and we brought our kids in, because we were part of the community. And then each elder took a turn talking about what they thought Sasquatch was and what it meant.
Hmm.
And there was no consistency. I mean, they all had very different ideas. One did an entire speech in the Clallam language, which I don't speak Clallam. I didn't understand it, but I completely understood it because, the way he gestured and the way he emphasized things, that it was very clear kind of where he was going with that. But so they left it all there, kind of just left it all there first. And the kids got to decide and the parents got to decide, well, which of these makes the most sense to you? Which I think is just such a lovely solution.
Yeah.
But it did get me asking bigger questions about why is this happening? Why now? Why is this going on? And at the time, the tribe was still in negotiations with the federal government and with the state of Washington to remove 2 hydroelectric dams from their main salmon stream, the Elwha River. And it was all in flux. I mean, everybody was quite hopeful that eventually the dams would be removed. And this was important because they had a traditional salmon fishery that was just out of this world. They have like all 5 species of Pacific salmon and steelhead, which is an ocean-going trout, that historically came back to the river to spawn. So it was a huge fishery for the tribal peoples there. But with the 2 dams, because they were built in the early part of the 19th century and they were built without fish ladders, which are necessary to get so the fish can get over the dam to get to their spawning grounds.
Right.
That meant it just basically decimated the runs. And so the fish had to spawn in a lower part of the river that was not the pristine, wonderful place where they were accustomed to spawning. And of course, the numbers of fish went down because of that. And so the tribe wanted to remove the 2 dams in the effort to fix the salmon runs. So they had to do a lot of work. They had to, work out that with the federal government, with the, Army Corps of Engineers, with, the state of Washington, all of that. And to get to that point, they had to do a lot of river restoration first in the lower part of the river. So there was lots and lots of work before you couldn't just go up and start taking them down brick by brick, had to plan for it.
Yeah.
But through this period of time when things were more in flux, that's when Sasquatch starts showing up more. And I just feel, and I always interpret him as a environmental monster is sort of how I think about him, is that he's a very powerful spirit to people. He can do things that are good. He can also be very dangerous for people, and I think showing up and being around and people catching glimpses of him was a way to sort of reinforce the value of what they were doing, that he's a protector. And I think he was there to protect.
Yeah. Interesting.
To remind people that these things matter.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that actually leads into a question of how can these stories about monsters and cryptids and ghosts sort of inform us, or what do they teach us about history and, in this instance, colonization and the persistence of indigenous people? What can these stories inform us of what's going on?
I always take it through the lens of, I teach a class on monsters now. It's a 100 level class that mostly gets incoming freshmen, and it's a way to introduce them to anthropology, but also to research skills and just sort of building up their skills. So for they have more positive experiences moving forward. And so what I always tell the students is that monsters are like a lens. You can look through that lens and you can see things refracted in different ways. So for Native peoples, maybe those monsters are a sign of something important happening, like Sasquatch showing up, that whatever was going to happen, clearly it mattered because Sasquatch just wouldn't show up.
Right.
People have similar kinds of stories about Wendigo here in the Great Lakes region. And Wendigo is a cannibal monster that, can start out human, but then traditionally how a Wendigo got made was that maybe people who were living in the subarctic region of the Great Lakes, which is a very, very fragile environment that, people would starve during the winter, people would go hungry because it's just a difficult place to live. And so maybe they would be tempted to practice cannibalism because they were hungry. And if they did, then they'd be in danger of turning into a Wendigo, this ice-hearted cannibal monster. And that's one way to think about Wendigo. And then like Sasquatch, Wendigo's also been co-opted by popular culture. So there's now horror movies that have very little to do with, sort of the complicated stories of Wendigo that come from traditional cultures and more about sort of entertaining people in sort of a big Hollywood kind of way, right?
Yeah.
But then another thing that Native peoples have done to sort of co-opt when to go back is to think about Wendigo like the ice-hearted cannibal monsters representing settlers.
Mm.
Maybe they're the Wendigos. Maybe they're the ones eating things up they shouldn't be eating and
Yeah.
turning into monsters. So I think that that's what I love about teaching about monsters is it's never just one view of them. It's always these multiple views. And it's good for me because then I don't have to come down on the one side or the other side.
Yeah.
Most of my students are settler colonial descendants,
Right.
I don't want to spend an entire semester making them feel terrible about, who their ancestors are.
Right.
That's not my mission, right?
Right. Right.
But I do want them to think about that, but I also want them to be able to sort of see it in different ways so they can take the time to critically engage with ideas.
Yeah.
Where they don't feel like they have to like land on one of them and say, this is the right idea.
Right. What are maybe some misconceptions that you've encountered with, Indigenous folk stories or ghost stories that you wish people had a better understanding of?
Well, Wendigo's one of them
Mhm.
because a lot of students have heard about that particular monster, but they don't often have the context. And I would say that where people get their information about Native peoples is often kind of suspect, I guess.
Yeah.
And what they generally don't do is go directly to Native peoples
Right.
as the sources. And what I always say is that I will, for my entire life, no matter how much I know, I will always be a student of these cultures.
Sure.
I will never be an expert. A 5-year-old child at Lower Elwha Clallam is more of an expert of Clallam life and identity and issues than I will ever be,
Sure.
because it's their culture, it's who they are. So talking to Native peoples, reading the books they write. There's this wonderful author from a Northwest Coast First Nation in Canada, in Vancouver. I think it's Vancouver Island. She wrote a book called Monkey Beach. It's a novel. Her name is Eden Robinson. When I was at Wesleyan doing my postdoc, we actually brought Eden Robinson to Wesleyan to talk to students. And she's fantastic. She's a fabulous writer. If you want to know about what Sasquatch means in a Native context, read that book. It's a wonderful book, right? Cool. So there's that. I had something else I was going to say about that. I lost it for a second.
Oh, just like misconceptions.
Misconceptions.
Yeah.
So probably one of the biggest ones that I have dealt with over the years is the Twilight franchise.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's set on the Olympic Peninsula. Forks, Washington's a real place. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hours from where I lived, and the Quileute Nation is a real tribe. It's next door to Lower Elwha Clallam. I mean, as the crow flies, it's still pretty far away. And so when it was super, super popular, and when I had more millennial students who were coming into college, and they had read all those books as teenagers and as tweens, right? Sure. And they were seeing the movies. So I felt I spent more time sort of in the class on monsters talking about, well, here's how Stephanie Myers, who is an author, who is free to write what she wants to write. She's a novelist. She's not writing history or culture, right? But here's how she sort of presents things. But here's what it's really like at Quileute. They're not just all in the woods. There's a restaurant, there's fishing boats, there's a hotel you can stay in, cool little cabins. It's a whole world, right? Unto itself. And so stuff like that, trying to get them to understand that, that what you're seeing in the films might be really intriguing and interesting, but it's not necessarily a reflection of how people authentically live their lives. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I will say that the Quileute probably did the best job I've ever seen of a tribe sort of dealing with that very basic problem of how people think about them.
Yeah.
And when those books were super popular, it boosted tourism on the Olympic Peninsula, which is already a tourist heavy place, but there was even more. And a lot of people wanted to go to Forks, which if you've never been to a Midwest Rust Belt town, this is like that, only it's post timber. It's like if all of a sudden tourists wanted to come to Muncie.
Right.
Okay. No offense, Muncie.
Yeah, no.
But for people who actually live on the Olympic Peninsula, it didn't make a lot of sense,
right.
Except that these things were really, really popular. And so going to the Forks meant they also wanted to go down to the Quileute Reservation, where the Quileute werewolves were from. And so they would go down there, and mostly they would, maybe eat at the restaurant or stay in the hotel. And Quileute actually created a cabin that's just Twilight themed.
Oh, cool.
They have a sign up where the reservation starts. This is the vampire, wolf boundary.
Yeah.
So they have played with it in some really funny ways, that I think is great, and I'm sure tourists appreciate it.
Yeah.
But then they had somebody come down. It was like a film crew, and they started filming, and then they put up like this tour online, and they were filming inside like the tribal cemetery and trying to make it look super creepy. And that was a no. That was an absolute, you can't do that. And they actually worked to have them take that down, so they would not be doing that. At the same time, they also found ways to engage tourists that were more on their own terms. So they would, it's like people would come down, and if they were doing a drum circle in the gym at the school, they would invite tourists to come in and sit with them, which is an amazingly gracious thing. Imagine you're in the midst of something that is both spiritual and cultural and very important to who you identify as people. And these strangers walk in, and you say, you know what? We're not going to chase you away. You just come join us.
Yeah.
You just come and learn about our real culture and who we really are, which I thought was just incredibly awesome.
Yeah, that's really generous. And I escaped Twilight. I've not read any of the books. I have not watched any of the movies. I do know that there was some glitter on skin, which I'm very all about that sparkly skin. Were werewolves and vampires part of that area's history, or was it something made up for the books?
Well, it's really interesting because the Quileute stories of wolves include stories of humans transforming into wolves or wolves transforming into humans. It's part of traditional Northwest Coast mythologies. They have these stories. All the cultures of the Northwest Coast have these stories that go back to the time that in English they talk of as the animal people. And it was before humans like you or I, actual humans, had arrived.
Yeah.
So the world it isn't so much like creation happened and then the world was just full blown ready to go.
Right.
Like we think of like in the Old Testament. It was more like the world was there and some things had been created, but it was more unfinished. And the kind of sentient beings that occupied it were these animal people who had qualities that were both human and animal. So in the stories, you'll see things like people will talk about how Raven takes off his raven cape and becomes a human figure. And that's what they're talking about, this transformative process. So the Quileute have these stories of wolves transforming into people. And that is part of their traditional storytelling kind of narratives.
Yeah.
One thing they did is that they had members of the community do a YouTube video, like I think 3 different members who told those stories, who actually shared them in it's a great video. I haven't looked for it for a while. I don't know if it's still up, but if you can find it, it's well worth watching. And the stories are really intriguing, and they're very graciously sharing aspects of their culture. But what I would show students is that you could look at that video, and this is back when the movies were first coming out. Right?
Yeah.
You could look at that and see how many times it had been viewed on YouTube. It was maybe, 1,000 or something like that.
Sure.
Then there's a clip from the second Twilight movie, which is New Moon, which is the story of the wolves, where it's, native people sitting around with the vampires and, it's not the vampires yet. It's just native people sitting around, and Bella, the main character, who's non-native, is there too. And then they share these stories of like vampires coming to the Olympic Peninsula, long time ago. And of course it's the vampire family that lives there. They were just, they're older than they look,
Sure.
kind of thing. Right.
Sure.
So it has the feel of a traditional story, but it's all made up, it's not, it's from a novel. And that was watched like 1 million times.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So even, tribes have when it gets into sort of the larger popular culture, try as they might, it's very difficult sometimes for them to message things because they're just overrun by, larger cultural messages that are more appealing to people, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. By vampires.
By vampires.
Yeah. It's very vampiric behavior. Do you have
you would do well in my monsters class.
All right. I love it. I am 100 level collegiate still. Actually, when you said that, I was like, man, it'd be fun to just go to universities and do 100 level classes again. Like, just so much
you
fun.
You can 100% do that. University of Washington allows anybody to take a class. You can take
just
it for like
audit.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, so much fun. Do you have like whether it's from your I mean, it's all your life, but your personal life, your research, whatever, do you have a favorite ghost story that sticks out to you?
I think the one of the little girl of my personal ghost experiences is my
Yeah.
favorite, only because I had witnesses.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one with seeing a full body apparition, I have learned from listening to way too many paranormal podcasts, is actually a fairly rare experience. So in theory, that should be my favorite because it rarely happens that people
Yeah.
see that. But the one where I actually have backup, where my son would, if he was here, he would say, "Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
remember that."
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
It makes you feel less crazy when you're a scientist.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And like, are there any stories that have stuck out to you that like you've heard other people talk about? Like, I just as part of this spooky season podcast series, I just talked to Dr. Murphy about the lottery, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, which just like has haunted me since I was 15 years old. Like, I think about it all
It's
the
so
time.
horrifying.
Like it's such a creepy story. It's so great. Shirley Jackson's so creepy and awesome. But like any stories like that that have just gotten under your skin over the years?
Yes, I would say The Others with Nicole Kidman. Have you seen that?
No, because I am a Charlie Brown Halloween person.
Well, I highly recommend you
Okay.
watch it. It is uncanny. It does have some spooky scenes in it, but it has the craziest twist at the end that it's worth watching just for that.
Okay.
So I actually, even though I know the twist, I will rewatch it just because Nicole Kidman is so fabulous in it.
Yeah.
And she plays like a lady. It's like the end of World War II, and her husband is gone off to war, and she's living on one of the barrier islands of the UK,
Uh-huh.
with her kids in this big old house. And they don't know where the husband is. They don't know if he's coming home or not.
Yeah.
But the Nazis had actually occupied her island.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
and so there's a lot that they're dealing with in the post World War II moment. And so the house becomes haunted. And that's all I'm going to say
Okay.
because it literally
I
is to give away the twist and you don't
I
want to
will
end it.
watch it. I will
Yeah.
watch it during the daytime with someone else with me. I'm such a scaredy cat. All right, I will have to read that. And then my sort of additional question on top of that is if you could invite like a ghost or figure or cryptid to sit down with us and talk to them, like who would it be?
I would invite, I would probably invite either Sasquatch, even though it could be quite smelly
Mhm.
and possibly not very communicative in a way that we would understand. But I just think part of me would love to just say, see, people aren't crazy. There really is a Sasquatch, just
Yeah.
just as visual evidence. But I
Yeah.
would suppose I often do this little thing in my mind where I think about my favorite tea party in heaven, like all the dead people
Yeah.
that I can't wait to sit down and have conversations with. And the people that I would sit down with change all the time. It's like sometimes they're famous people. I wouldn't mind bringing the ghost of my grandmother who was Roma because she died long before I was born. And we have so many questions. We were
Oh
raised
yeah.
in an Irish Catholic community, but here's this little piece of interest that, we don't know as much about. And I would love to invite her down and just sit her down and say, okay, spill the
Yeah.
tea. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. Those are two good ones. Well, this has been so much fun. I feel like I could talk to you all day. Is there anything that you want to make sure listeners know or think about that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I think that, magic is all around us,
Yeah,
whether we acknowledge it or not. Interesting things are all around us. And I personally, because, things are a little stressful in the United States of America right now. That's
I
all I'm
haven't
going to say
noticed.
about
Yeah.
that. Yeah. But I find that like reading a really good scary novel, I'm a huge Stephen King fan. And that's my other thing is that since I've had cancer, I will tell my family if it ever reoccurs and it's my last trip to Disneyland time, then I want lunch with Stephen King.
Nice.
And I think they can make it happen.
I think they can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
I love his books, but reading something scary or reading, or watching a scary film is just kind of a fun way to sort of let yourself go a little bit and think about something bigger than you.
Mhm.
To just remember that the world's a big place and it's always been a big place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something about are stories about ghosts and monsters and things that go bump in the night throughout time, that's very reassuring, right? Like it's, but as humans, we've dealt with insecurity and uncertainness, and it's interesting to see the through lines throughout history of these stories. So,
Well, they connect us to our ancestors, right?
yeah,
And our ancestors are what made us, whether we know them personally or not. You know, we all, I mean, in some ways, it's like a scholar down at Indiana University who works in the folklore department says it best. She says, you know, it's not whether you believe in ghosts or not, but we're all made up of ghosts because we all carry their DNA.
yeah,
And I love thinking about that.
I love that. Yeah, yeah. I have some questions for some of my traits that I got. Well, this has been so much fun. What do you love most about this work?
I think if I think about it in terms of my work as a scholar, I think I have one of the best jobs in the world because every day I'm put in a situation where I get to learn something I didn't know.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I was a kid who loved school. I was the kid who was happiest on the first day of school and really glad when summer ended.
Yeah.
You know, and so I just never left. You
Yeah.
know, to me, I'm living my dream as far as I'm concerned. I think working with my students, though, is probably the greatest joy of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Besides my son.
yes. What advice would you give to your younger self?
Well, since I did have cancer at a young age and I was very poor, I was a single mom, you know, I was a full-time student. We were really, you know, we were struggling under the best of circumstances. And I think that if I could talk to younger me, I would say to me to think about, to not put so much, you know, not spend so much time ruminating about what might happen, what could happen, about the future, that the future's not written yet. So you have to sort of stay in the present moment. You know, I had to quit school for a year, which at the time just felt like a kind of death for me. I felt like, oh, on top of not knowing if I'm going to be alive or not in a year, I have to give up this thing. It felt like I was giving up a piece of me I didn't want to give up.
Yeah.
But what I learned from that was that when you have a dream that's denied, it doesn't mean, or delayed, it doesn't mean it's denied. And I think I would remind myself of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very powerful. And how can people find you?
Well, I work at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, and my email is CE I will, I should just spell it out, CEMURRAY at bsu.edu. And I'm always open to hearing people's stories. And if somebody's got a great ghost story they want to share, I'm all ears.
Awesome. I love that. Be careful putting that out there because you might you might get a lot of
and fair warning, I might use it in an article. You know,
there you go. There you
only
go.
share what you want shared.
I love that. Well, this has been such a fun conversation. I think you have such a great job.
Thank you.
And your students are very lucky because you make it so accessible. So thanks for spending so much time with us today.
It was so nice to meet you.
You too. Thanks for listening to Wait, What Do You Do Again? For more information about today's guest, or if you'd like to be on the show, please visit megdeford.com. See you next time.